May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across the Atlantic, church bells were ringing. Crowds were roaring, newspapers thudded against doorsteps with giant black headlines, "Germany surrenders unconditionally." The war in Europe is over. In Times Square, sailors kissed strangers. In Washington, flags unfurled like waves. In London, Churchill's voice thundered through radios, triumphant, trembling, exhausted. But at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, the morning did not begin with celebration. It began with silence. A cold, metallic silence that cut through the crisp spring air like a razor. The kind of silence that made birds pause mid-song, that made guards glance at each other with a tight, uneasy flicker of dread. Something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong. Because while the free world was cheering, 800 German POWs at Fort Devens were not moving, not celebrating, not smiling, not packing for home. They stood on the parade ground in rigid formation, shoulders squared, jaws locked, eyes fixed forward, a solid wall of motionless defiance under the rising American flag. This was no morning drill. This was no military routine. This was resistance, the kind of resistance no American officer had ever seen on U.S. soil. At 6:11 a.m., Captain Helen Rogers received the first report. "Ma'am, the prisoners won't stand down." At 6:14 a.m., another. "They're refusing to disperse, all 800. At 6:17 a.m., the third report hit her desk like a hammer. "They're refusing everything." Rogers rushed into the yard, boots thudding across the gravel, morning frost cracking under her heels, steam curled from her breath. The sun glinted off the barbed wire. The American flag snapped above her head, sharp, bright, victorious. But the men before her did not look defeated. They looked carved, stone-hard, immovable. The same men who had flinched at thunder when they first arrived now stood like they were facing down artillery fire. She stepped onto the wooden platform, a stack of repatriation orders clutched under her arm, the papers whipping violently in the wind. She didn't bother with the megaphone. "Prisoners of war," she shouted. "Germany has surrendered. The war is over. You will be repatriated immediately." The words should have broken the formation, should have unleashed cheers, tears, anything. But the silence deepened, thickened, hardened. 800 pairs of eyes stared straight ahead. No blinking, no trembling, no relief. Just that eerie iron discipline. Rogers slammed the stack of orders on the podium. The sound cracked through the air like a rifle shot. "This is good news," she barked. "You're going home, to your country, to your families." Behind her, the flag snapped again, loud, proud, victorious, as if the very air was reminding them. "You are no longer enemies. You are free." But they did not move. Not one. The guards shifted uneasily. A cook stepped out of the mess hall, dish towel in hand, staring. A clerk froze halfway down the steps of the administration building. The entire fort seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the third row, a single man broke formation. A young German stepped forward, his boots crunching in the gravel, his hands trembling against his sides. He was tall, thin, sun-browned from months of Texas labor. A former radio operator from Hamburg, Eric Bauer. He took one breath, deep, steady, defiant, the kind of breath a man takes before confessing something unforgivable. "Ma'am," he said, voice cutting clean through the cold morning air, "we're not going home." Rogers blinked. "What did you say?" Eric lifted his chin, eyes shining with something between fear and resolve. "We don't want to return to Germany." The murmurs behind him swelled. boots shifting, breath tightening, hearts hammering. Eric went on, louder now, the words trembling but unbreakable. "We want to stay. Here, in America." The words struck the parade ground like a thunderbolt. A German POW refusing freedom, refusing his homeland, refusing everything he had been taught to dream of. Captain Rogers stared at him, stunned. "You want to stay in a prison camp?" she asked, voice cracking. Eric nodded once, slow, irrevocable. "Yes, ma'am. We would rather remain prisoners in America than be free anywhere else." And in that impossible moment, as the wind twisted the fallen papers around her boots and the flag snapped high above them, she realized this wasn't defiance. This wasn't mutiny. This was desperation, and it was only the beginning. The shock on the parade ground at Fort Devens did not fade quickly. It lingered, heavy, electric, trembling beneath every breath, long after Captain Rogers dismissed the formation and the guards dispersed in uneasy silence. But that moment, that impossible declaration, "We want to stay in America," had roots stretching back a full year, back to the day the prisoners first touched American soil, back to the moment the world they thought they understood collapsed. And it began with a smell. When the Liberty ship finally groaned into port on the eastern seaboard, the German POWs braced for hell. They clung to everything they had been told, everything drilled into them since their first day in uniform. Americans are brutal. Americans starve their prisoners. Americans beat and torture, because they are weak and fearful. So the moment the anchors bit into mud and the ramps clattered into place, the men tensed. Jawlines clenched, breath shortened, muscles coiled. And then the first shock hit them. It wasn't guns, it wasn't shouting, it wasn't even the sight of the soldiers waiting at the docks. It was smell. Warm, sweet, dizzying smell. Smells they had nearly forgotten were real. Fresh bread, roasting meat, coffee, strong, bitter, impossibly rich. Steam drifted from warehouse. Kitchens. Somewhere a truck idled, carrying crates marked U.S. Army Food Services. A baker's cart rolled past, wheels rattling on cobblestone, spilling the scent of warm yeast and butter into the morning air. Several POWs swallowed hard in unison. For months they had eaten gray crusts, thin soup, the ghost of meat. Some had lived through the siege of Normandy. Others had survived the firebombing of their home cities. All had known hunger that stripped the body and then the mind. Now, with a single breath, the smell of abundance punched straight into their chests. Unteroffizier Otto Brandt murmured, "God, is this a dream?" No one answered. The American MPs were moving toward them, but not the way they expected. No rush, no rifles pointed at their faces, no snarling dogs or curses, just quiet professionalism. One MP, tall and easygoing, strolled through the line chewing gum, his helmet tilted slightly back, like he had all the time in the world. He stopped, looked at the stunned Germans, and said in a relaxed drawl, "Welcome to America, boys. Keep the line moving." The words hit like a blow. Not cruel, not mocking, not triumphant. Simply human. A few prisoners flinched, expecting sarcasm. Others stood frozen, mouths slightly open. Unteroffizier Hans Neumann whispered to the man beside him, disbelief shaking through his voice. "They greet us. We invaded half the world. And they greet us." The others stared, wide-eyed, hollow-cheeked, trembling, not at the soldiers but at everything behind them. Paved roads, pallets stacked high with supplies, fresh uniforms hung in neat bundles, trucks, hundreds of them, idling in perfect formation, electric lights humming bright even though the sun was up. It was like stepping into another century. A corporal from Munich muttered, "But their factories were supposed to be collapsing." A private from Bremen shook his head. Propaganda. All of it. For years, the Reich had told them America was weak, fractured, starving, a mongrel nation, a land of chaos and corruption, a country that could never stand against Germany's will. Yet here, on their very first steps onto American soil, those lies fell apart like wet paper. The prisoners watched as cranes swung overhead, unloading crates marked medical, fuel, ration meat, ration coffee, rail parts, motor oil. They watched as American soldiers laughed, slapped each other on the shoulder, flicked cigarettes into the water. They watched as a jeep rumbled past, bright and clean, not the rickety machine the propaganda films had shown. Everywhere they looked, abundance. Everywhere they listened, confidence. Everywhere they breathed, prosperity. A sergeant from Stuttgart tightened his grip on his duffel and whispered through clenched teeth, "This country. It's not starving, it's not weak, it's not anything we were told." Neumann's voice answered him, low and shaken. "It's worse than that." "Worse?" Neumann nodded slowly. "It's strong, too strong." He wasn't talking about soldiers or weapons or factories. He was talking about everything. The calm discipline, the effortless wealth, the unshakable self-assurance, the friendliness that cost the giver nothing, but stripped the receiver bare. One MP passed by with a clipboard, giving directions with the tone of someone organizing a local baseball game, not handling prisoners of war. "All right, fellas, single file, medical checks in the first hangar, fresh clothes after that. Let's make it smooth, keep it civil." His voice was warm, steady, utterly nonchalant. This, more than anything, terrified them. American strength was not loud, not theatrical, not forced. It was casual. That was what made it dangerous. As the line shuffled toward processing, Eric Bauer lifted his eyes to the American flag rippling above the docks, bright, clean, enormous against the morning sky. For the first time in his life, the sight of another nation's flag made his stomach drop, not from hatred, but from the dawning realization. They were stepping into the arms of a country too powerful to hate and too humane to fear, and none of them, not a single one, could possibly guess that a year later, on another spring morning at Fort Devens, they would stand together in a silent uprising. Not to escape America, but to beg to remain prisoners of it. The day they first inhaled the scent of American abundance marked the collapse of everything they had been taught. But shock is only the beginning of transformation. What followed, the slow, relentless erosion of old certainties, was far more dangerous to the world they had come from. Because fear fades, but dignity rewrites the soul. And for the prisoners at Camp Hearn, that rewriting began quietly, almost invisibly, in the weeks after their arrival. Something strange happened after those first disorienting days in America. The fear, the rigid, trembling kind that clung to their bones, began to loosen its grip. The shock of safety, of food, of warm beds gave way to something gentler, quieter, more confusing. Routine, work, meals, rest, a predictable rhythm they had forgotten existed, and in that steady rhythm, invisible threads began to tie captor and captive together. It started with the guards. American MPs were not like German officers or SS supervisors. They didn't bark for the sake of hearing their own voices. They didn't snatch away privileges just to see fear. They didn't kick or slap or shove. Most of them were boys, farm boys, factory boys, boys who had joined the army because the world had forced them to, and they spoke to the POWs like people. "Morning, fellas. Stay hydrated. Texas sun'll kill you faster than a bullet. Need help with that wire spool? The Germans didn't know how to respond. Some stiffened in suspicion, some nodded awkwardly, some avoided eye contact. But it was the cowboys who broke the barrier first. Local ranchers had been contracting POW labor, and the Army sent groups of Germans out on trucks to mend fences, move cattle, repair barns, and haul lumber. Cowboys didn't care about politics, or ideology, or uniform color. They cared about work ethic. If a man pulled his weight, he earned a nod. If he slacked, he heard about it. Simple, direct, understandable. Private Jack Miller was one of those men. He wasn't a talker. He wasn't interested in proving America's greatness or correcting Nazi lies. He wanted the fences straight, the tools oiled, and the job done before the sun dipped behind the mesquite trees. Eric Bauer, assigned to Jack's detail, learned this the hard way. Jack moved with a kind of quiet, unbothered efficiency. Measured steps, quick hands, no wasted motion. On the first day, he handed Eric a post-hole digger and pointed at a row of leaning fence posts. "Fix 'em," he said. "No hostility, no suspicion, just expectation." Eric nodded, unsure whether the man was testing him or simply telling him the truth. By the end of the week, Jack had offered him a canteen, a sandwich, and a spare pair of work gloves. By the end of the month, they worked side by side without speaking, their movements falling into rhythm like two gears in the same machine. And then something even stranger happened. They began to talk. Not deeply at first, not intimately, just small things. Jack pointing at a hawk circling overhead, Eric asking how to say a word in English, Jack showing him how to tie a proper Texas knot, Eric humming a tune under his breath. That tune, soft, hesitant, was what broke open the first smile Jack had seen on a German's face. "You know, you are my sunshine," he asked. Eric shrugged, embarrassed. "We heard it on radio once." Jack snorted. "Come on then, sing it right." And so, under a wide Texas sky, a cowboy and a German POW sang a song together in a field filled with cedar posts and dust. It spread from there, quiet as wildfire. Soon the Germans were learning English phrases. "Howdy," "Much obliged," "See you tomorrow." They worked alongside Americans, ate with them on the tailgates of trucks, shared shade beneath barn roofs, and once, only once, were invited to a Sunday baseball game in town. The prisoners sat in a roped-off section of the bleachers, closely guarded but not feared, not hated. Families brought blankets and lemonade. Kids stared wide-eyed at the Germans but didn't look afraid. A rancher's daughter even waved. One POW waved back. The guards didn't scold him. It felt human. More human than anything they had known in years, and that terrified them far more than the rifles ever had. One evening, as the sun flared orange over the plains, Eric and Jack were stacking lumber behind a barn. Sweat rolled down their backs. Sawdust stuck to their arms. Crickets chirped in the long grass. Eric had been silent all day, thoughts churning like storm clouds. At last he spoke, the words cracking through the dusk. "Jack, why are you kind to us?" A pause. "We are your enemy." Jack didn't answer right away. He set down the plank he was carrying, wiped his forehead with the back of his glove, and stared out at the sinking sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost mournful. "War says you're the enemy." He leaned on the fence rail. "But hunger, pain, cold, those don't care about uniforms." He looked at Eric then, really looked at him. "You're men. Men ought to be treated like men." Simple, matter of fact, unadorned by philosophy or politics. but those words tore through Eric more violently than any artillery shell. He had seen his own officers leave wounded men to die in the mud. He had watched prisoners shot during retreats because they slowed the column. He had been told kindness was weakness. Yet here, under the vast American sky, a man with no reason to care, no reason at all, chose decency. That night in his bunk, Eric opened his small, worn diary. His hand trembled as he wrote, "They defeated us not with hate, but with decency, and that is harder to bear." And in the quiet of the barracks, with the window cracked open to let in the scent of hay and distant barbecue smoke, he realized this land was reshaping him, not with force, not with fear, but with humanity. The sentence Eric wrote in his diary that night, "They defeated us with decency," didn't stay pressed between the pages. It followed him the next morning and the next, settling deeper into him with every sunrise over the Texas plains. Because moral clarity is one thing in words and another in the warmth of real human kindness. And soon that kindness would surround the German prisoners so completely, so gently, they could no longer pretend it was an accident of circumstance. It was the American way. The first true lesson in American humanity came with breakfast. The POWs entered the mess hall in stiff lines, eyes low, shoulders tensed. They expected metal bowls slapped into their hands, thin broths, stale crusts, German-style prison rations. Instead, they froze. The air was thick with the smell they had nearly forgotten existed. Bacon. Real bacon. Not ration scraps. Not the memory of bacon, but thick, sizzling slices cracking in cast-iron skillets behind the serving line. Next to it, fluffy scrambled eggs, warm bread, butter, steaming coffee. A feast by wartime standards, luxury by German standards, a miracle by POW standards. Eric stepped forward, tray shaking slightly. The American cook, Sergeant Red McIntyre, face ruddy from heat and good humor, grinned at him and dropped 2 strips of bacon on the plate. "Eat up, son. You look like you haven't seen meat since the Kaiser." The joke stunned him. Americans joked with prisoners? Eric lifted the bacon, hands trembling. The smell hit him first. Salt, fat, smoke, memory. Then he took a bite. Warm, rich, tender. He didn't just taste food, he tasted a life he thought the war had stolen forever. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He turned away from the line and pressed his fist against his mouth, shoulders shaking. No guard mocked him, no prisoner sneered. The only sound was McIntyre's gentle voice. "Take your time, son." That was the first crack. And once mercy cracks a man open, the light pours in quickly. A week later, the truck rattled down a dusty back road to the Harrison Ranch, where a work crew of POWs, including Eric, spent afternoons repairing storm-damaged fencing. Tom Harrison, a broad-shouldered man with quiet eyes, treated the Germans like hired help rather than prisoners. He showed them how to tighten wire, how to brace a sagging post, how to judge a cattle trail. But on Sunday, he did something unheard of. He invited them inside. The prisoners entered the farmhouse hesitantly, hats in hand, boots dirty with red Texas clay. They expected a separate table, separate dishes, distance. Instead, Mrs. Harrison waved them in with a warm, flour-dusty smile. "Come on, boys, food's getting cold." On the table sat roast chicken, golden and glistening, mashed potatoes with creamy gravy, green beans from the garden, soft dinner rolls, and apple pie cooling near the window. The Germans ate slowly at first, waiting for the catch. There was none. The youngest POW, a baker from Munich, whispered, "In Germany, this is Christmas." Mrs. Harrison refilled his plate. "Well, honey, here it's just Sunday." The men ate until their faces flushed. Some wiped tears discreetly. One murmured, "I had forgotten what it feels like to be someone's guest." A few days later, while unloading crates behind the mess hall, Eric noticed American soldiers passing around small glass bottles filled with a dark, fizzing liquid. A private held one out. "You never tried Coke, have you?" Eric hesitated. The soldier popped the cap with a flick, placed the bottle in his hand. "Go on. Cold one won't kill you." The first sip was like lightning. Sweet, sharp, bubbling. Eric nearly choked. The private burst out laughing. "Told ya, shock to the system." Eric stared at the bottle in awe. "We have nothing like this." "Stick around," the private said with a wink. "You'll see we got all kinds of magic." For the first time since capture, Eric laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded, unbroken. Ranch work required horses, and horses required courage. Most POWs had never ridden one. Some had never touched one. But the cowboys didn't mock them. They taught them. One hot afternoon, Jack Miller slapped the flank of a chestnut mare and handed Eric the reins. "Don't think. Just sit deep and hang on." Eric swung into the saddle. The mare shifted. He wobbled wildly, then pitched sideways, hitting the dust with a grunt. The cowboys roared with laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the kind shared between men who work the land and respect whoever tries. Jack hauled him up with one arm. "Good. You fell right. Now get back on." Eric did. Again and again. By sundown, he completed a shaky circuit of the corral. The cowboys cheered like he had won the World Series. Eric had never felt more human. When a rusty nail tore open Eric's palm during fence repair, he hit it at first. Old habits. A wounded man is a burden. But Jack saw the blood. "Hell with that. You're coming with me." He dragged him to the infirmary where Lieutenant Marcus Hayes cleaned, disinfected, and stitched the wound with professional precision. Eric winced. Hayes spoke softly. "You'll keep the hand. A few days' rest, and you're fine." Eric stared at him. "You helped me, even though—" Hayes cut him off gently. "You're under our care. That's all that matters." Eric whispered, "You are. Good giants." Hayes chuckled. "I'll take that." By the end of summer, the POWs no longer whispered the word Amerikaner with fear. They said it with bewildered admiration, because the Americans had proven something devastatingly simple. They had enough food to share, enough kindness to spare, enough strength to treat even enemies like men. And to the Germans, raised on discipline, scarcity, brutality, and hierarchy, this gentleness was not weakness. It was power. Autumn crept across the camp with long shadows and a cooler wind. The heat softened. The days shortened. The fat Texas clouds rolled low across the plains like drifting ships. Work continued. Meals continued. Lessons continued. But something shifted beneath the surface. Letters from home began to arrive. They came sporadically, carried by Red Cross trucks, sorted by American clerks who stacked the envelopes in neat bundles. The prisoners gathered each afternoon near the mail shed, faces tight with hope and dread, hands gripping fence wire, breath held like a prayer. Most days there was little: a postcard, a smudged signature, a note from a neighbor, sometimes nothing. But one morning, Eric heard his name. "Bauer, letter, Germany." His heart lurched. He stepped forward as the clerk handed him a thin, dust-stained envelope. His fingers trembled. The postmark was faded. The handwriting shaky, cramped, desperate. He walked behind the barracks, sat on an overturned crate, and opened it. The world inside him collapsed. The letter was from Frau Schneider, their elderly neighbor. Not his mother, not his brother, just Frau Schneider. She apologized, over and over for being the one to write. She said she wished she had better news. She said she hoped he was safe in America, whatever that meant. Then the words that cut bone. Your mother passed in February. There was no food. She grew weak, then very weak, and one day she did not wake. The letter slipped from his fingers. He stared at the dirt, at the sky, at nothing. His mother, who saved sugar cubes for Christmas, who warmed his socks on the stove before school, who braided her hair the same way every morning, dead from hunger, while he had eaten bacon and chicken and apple pie and drank Coca-Cola from bottles that glistened with ice. He doubled over, pressing both hands to his forehead as if trying to hold his skull together. More words burned in his vision. Your family home is gone, bombed in January. Your brother was missing after the raid. We fear the worst. He made no sound, just a low, strangled exhale, a wounded animal trying not to cry out. A few yards away, an American MP, Private Sam Whitaker, noticed him. Sam had seen that posture before, in France, in Belgium, in foxholes full of American boys who had just learned their best friend was gone. He walked over, boots crunching softly in the dust, and crouched beside him. He didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't pry. He simply placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, a steady hand, warm, solid, human. Eric tried to breathe, failed, tried again. Finally, voice breaking, he whispered, "My mother. She died of hunger, my home, everything. Gone." Sam swallowed hard. He thought of his own mother in Kansas, alive, well-fed, writing him letters filled with news about harvests and neighbors and church picnics. He thought of his father fixing tractors and cursing the price of feed. He thought of his little sister singing on the porch swing. He felt something twist inside him, something painful, something guilt-shaped. "I'm sorry," he murmured. Eric's eyes, red and hollow, lifted slowly. "Why?" he choked out. "Why are you kind to us? We are your enemy. We fought you, killed your friends. Why help us?" Sam exhaled. Not a sigh, something heavier. He sat down beside Eric in the dust, legs stretched out back against the barracks wall. The sun was warm on their faces. The wind rustled the dry grass. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "War says you're the enemy." He paused. "But hunger, pain, cold, those don't care about uniforms." Eric blinked, tears slipping down his cheeks. Sam continued, voice steady but low. "You're a man, and men ought to eat, men ought to be treated right." The simplicity of the words split Eric in two. He had been told Americans were barbarians, savages, weak, corrupt, cruel. And yet here was a young soldier, barely older than he was, sitting beside him in the dust, speaking as though compassion was a duty, not a luxury. Eric covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook, not from grief alone, but from the crushing weight of contradiction. He whispered into his palms, "We lost more than the war." Sam didn't ask what he meant. He understood. The POWs had not just lost cities or armies. They had lost the illusion that their nation had moral strength. They had lost the comfort of believing their suffering was righteous. They had lost the shield of propaganda. They had seen, with their own eyes, the thing Germany claimed America lacked: humanity, dignity, honor that survives even in victory. And Sam, staring at the broken young man beside him, felt something unexpected rise in his chest. Not triumph, not vindication, but sadness. Because in Eric's grief, he saw what could have been himself, just another son in another ruined country, starving, terrified, abandoned by the world. He spoke softly. "If you were my brother, I'd hope someone would treat him this way." Eric looked up, eyes shimmering, breath ragged. And for the first time since the war began, he felt something rise inside him, a painful, beautiful thing he almost didn't recognize. Gratitude. He didn't know, in that moment, that this collapse, this breaking open, was the turning point, the moment when the enemy became human, when kindness became unbearable, when the truth became impossible to escape. The Americans had defeated them in war, but in mercy, the Americans had won something far greater. The breakdown came like a storm, sudden, violent, undeniable. But storms, for all their destruction, leave the air clearer afterward. And in the days that followed Eric's collapse, something shifted inside him, and inside many of the men at Camp Hearn. The grief didn't fade, but it settled. The guilt didn't vanish, but it transformed. And in the quiet that came after, a new awareness began to bloom, painful, humbling, and profoundly human. It was the beginning of their awakening. Eric returned to work 3 days later. His hand was still bandaged, his eyes still red, but his posture had changed. The rigid soldier's stiffness had melted. In its place was something quieter, something more thoughtful, something almost open. That evening he sat alone beside the bunkhouse window and opened his diary once more. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar. The ink bled slightly when he wrote, his hand was unsteady, but his words were clear. They have shown us what strength really looks like. It is not cruelty. It is not domination. It is grace. He paused, listening to the camp around him. The hum of the generator, the distant shouts from the baseball field, the soft strain of a harmonica drifting through the dusk. He wrote again, "America defeated us with firepower, but they humbled us with kindness." It felt like treason to admit it, but it also felt like truth. The next afternoon, Private Jack Miller waved Eric over to the baseball diamond behind the barracks. "You ever try batting?" Jack asked, tossing him a wooden bat. Eric shook his head. Jack grinned. "Then today's the day." The bat felt foreign in Eric's hands. Awkward weight, smooth wood, the faint smell of pine. Jack positioned his feet, squared his shoulders, adjusted his grip. "Line your knuckles. Don't strangle the damn thing. And when the pitch comes, don't think. Just swing." The first pitch flew past him untouched. The second bounced off the dirt. The third connected, with a dull, clumsy thud, and rolled only a few feet. The Americans cheered anyway. "You hit it," one shouted. "Better than Miller on a bad day," another joked. Eric laughed, actually laughed, and jogged toward first base, boots crunching dirt as the afternoon sun wrapped around him like a warm blanket. In that moment, he did not feel like a prisoner. He felt like a teammate. Later, back in the barracks, another POW, Wilhelm Hartmann, older, once a schoolteacher, sat polishing his boots. The room was quiet except for the soft rubbing of cloth against leather. Then Wilhelm spoke, voice low. "America is a strange place." Eric glanced at him. "Why strange?" Wilhelm looked up, eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and bafflement. "Because it is the country we were told to hate," he said slowly, "and somehow it is the country we learned to love." The words hung in the air like incense, soft, lingering, undeniable. Other POWs paused, some swallowed hard, some nodded. They had all felt it, but few had dared to say it. Work assignments took the POWs across Texas. Farms, roads, mills, even small-town fairs during holidays. Everywhere they went, they saw pieces of America they had never imagined existed. A land untouched by war, roads smooth and unbombed, factories roaring with steel and energy, stores full of goods, families laughing, children playing freely in the open, churches hosting potlucks after Sunday service. This was not the America the Reich had described, not the sick, chaotic democracy on the verge of collapse, not the land of degeneracy and weakness painted on German posters. This America was strong, prosperous, confident, deeply united by a sense of purpose. The POWs heard Americans talk about sacrifice, rationing, victory gardens, war bonds, and brothers fighting overseas. They saw the pride in people's eyes when they spoke about the boys over there. Germany had fractured under pressure, America had risen. One POW summarized it perfectly. One nation fell apart, the other held together. One cool evening near the barn, Eric asked Jack a question that had been eating at him for weeks. "Jack, why did our leaders lie to us? About your country? About your people?" Jack leaned against the fence, chewing on a stalk of dry grass. "Son," he said, "men in power lie for two reasons: to stay in power or to start a fight." Eric closed his eyes. Germany had done both. Jack continued, "But truth finds its way through, even to men who were told never to trust it." Eric thought of his mother, his brother, his home, now rubble, his country, humiliated, his people, starving. Then he looked around him, at the lights glowing softly in the barracks, at the smell of supper drifting across the yard, at American soldiers joking with one another without fear or bitterness. He swallowed, hard. "Yes," he whispered, "truth finds its way." Some nights the POWs spoke in hushed tones about America and Germany, not political arguments, just quiet, painful comparisons. In Germany, the strong take. In America, the strong give. In Germany, we were tools. In America, we are men. In Germany, we were told to worship power. In America, power protects. One man added, "If Germany had treated its prisoners like this, perhaps our history would be different." The barracks fell silent. No one disagreed. That night, Eric returned to his diary. He stared at the blank page for a long time, listening to the soft hum of evening wind brushing against the window. Finally, he wrote, "Here, we were allowed to be human again." He set down the pencil. His throat tightened, but not from grief this time. From gratitude. Gratitude for the food, for the safety, for the decent work, for the baseball, for the Coke bottles clinking like tiny bells of wonder, for the cowboys who taught him to ride, for the doctor who saved his hand, for the guard who sat with him in the dust when his world collapsed. Gratitude for a country that defeated him on the battlefield and restored him afterward. As he closed the diary and lay down to sleep, he whispered to himself, "This is the America I never knew, the America I never believed existed, the America I will never forget." And in that whisper lay the truth at the heart of every POW in that camp. America had won their bodies in war, but through dignity, compassion, and quiet strength, America had captured their hearts. The moral awakening unfolded slowly, like dawn light spilling over a long broken landscape. But dawn, by its nature, always gives way to day, and day brings consequences. For all the peace the POWs found in America, one truth remained unchangeable. They were still prisoners of war, and wars, even the gentlest endings, demand a final reckoning. The reckoning arrived with a single sheet of paper. Winter was loosening its grip when the order came. The mess hall was warm with the smells of coffee and oatmeal when the prisoners filed in, boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. Conversations murmured through the room, small, ordinary, human sounds. Then Captain Helen Rogers stepped forward, unfolding a crisp document with hands that did not tremble but did not feel steady either. The room fell silent. "Men," she said, her voice firm but heavy. "As of this morning, The War Department has issued repatriation orders for all German POWs held in the United States. A soft gasp rippled through the room. Another breath, sharper, pained. A spoon clattered against a metal cup. Someone whispered, "No." Rogers continued, "You will be returned to Europe within the next 2 weeks. Processing begins tomorrow. Please prepare your belongings." The words echoed against the walls like the final toll of a bell. Eric felt his pulse spike, his breath shorten. Germany, the ruins, the hunger, the graves. He looked around. Faces were paling, throats tightening, hands gripping the edges of tables as if the wood might anchor them to the life they had built here. It was Private Sam Whitaker who noticed it first, the sudden stillness settling over the men like snowfall. "They're shutting down," he whispered to Jack. But it wasn't shutting down. It was resolve. The next morning, breakfast was served at 0600. By 0605, it was clear. Not a single German POW had touched their food. Not the oatmeal, not the bread, not even the coffee. 800 trays sat untouched, steam curling and fading into the cold morning air. The guards exchanged glances of alarm. Rogers stormed into the hall, eyes blazing. "What is this?" she demanded. "Explain yourselves." No one spoke. She slammed her hand against the nearest table. "This is an order. You will eat." Still nothing. Then, slowly, painfully, Eric rose to his feet. His face was determined. His eyes, wet but bright, did not waver. "Captain," he said, his voice tight with desperation, "we cannot go back. Not to that." He swallowed. "Don't send us back to the ruins." The words stabbed the air with a finality that made some guards flinch. Rogers stared at him, caught between authority and anguish. "It isn't my choice," she answered quietly. "It isn't anyone's here." Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "I wish we didn't have to." For a moment, time held still. POWs, guards, officers. All of them stood in the same heavy silence, full of things they wished they could change, but couldn't. When the trucks arrived, the prisoners lined up with their few belongings: a carved wooden spoon, a small notebook, a baseball, a pair of work gloves gifted by a cowboy. Objects that meant more than they should. The guards loaded them gently, not like prisoners but like men they respected. Each handshake lingered. Some clapped shoulders, some hugged awkwardly. Some could not speak at all. Eric reached Sam Whitaker last. "Thank you," he said softly. "For everything." Sam's jaw clenched. He looked away briefly, trying to steady himself. "You take care of yourself, Eric." "I'll try." Sam exhaled, voice cracking. "You remind me of my brother. Feels like I'm losing him all over again." Eric swallowed hard. "Then remember this," he said. "I lived because of Americans." Sam closed his eyes. They shook hands one final time, a handshake heavy with everything war had broken and everything mercy had restored. The trucks rumbled down the dirt road as the American guards stood shoulder to shoulder, watching them disappear in a cloud of pale dust. Some guards wiped their eyes. Others didn't bother to hide it. Tom Harrison, the rancher, raised his hat in silent farewell. McIntyre, the cook, muttered, "Damn fool should have stayed." Jack Miller didn't say a word. He just stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight. It was a departure that felt like a funeral. 3 days later, the prisoners were marched up the gangway of a transport ship docked in New York Harbor. The skyline towered over them, steel and confidence rising into the sky like a promise they could no longer keep. The wind whipped across the deck, cold and sharp. The city glittered. Lady Liberty watched in silence. The Germans lined the railings as the ship groaned to life. When the engines rumbled and the harbor began to drift away, Eric pressed his palms against the cool steel and whispered, not to anyone, but to the country that had changed him. I came as a prisoner. I leave as a witness of America. Around him, other men lowered their heads. Some prayed, some cried, some simply stared as the land of their captors and the land of their awakening slowly dissolved into the horizon. When the last glimmer of coastline vanished, Eric opened his diary one final time and wrote, "Compassion is the strongest weapon. It conquered us more completely than any war ever could." He closed the book with trembling fingers, and the ship carried them east, toward the ruins they had fled, away from the humanity they had found, leaving behind a nation that had shown them the one truth no propaganda could ever erase. America's greatest victory was not the war it won, but the mercy it gave.